thank you both for your mind-expanding talks. I wanted to begin this Q&A by asking about what you see the role of meditation being and how that levels up with the use of psychedelics. So if meditation can offer the same experience of a unity and allow us to shift from an anthropocentric to a more ecocentric outlook, how that compares to the psychedelic experience in your eyes. You can take through these ones.
So I think that, there's a lot said about the relationship between meditation and psychedelics. Not all of which I'm going to repeat, but and it has been said by people wiser than me that psychedelics are like a helicopter ride to the top of the mountain, whereas meditation is the slow walk up, but you get to savour the view and get to take in more of the environment on the way, and you get to stay up there for a lot longer. So I think there are some comparisons, but I don't think it's hard and fast that psychedelics and meditation necessarily lead to the same kind of experiences. But I think psychedelics have a use perhaps in opening up people to the kinds of states you may be able to access through practices like meditation. Interestingly, there's been a recent study at Johns Hopkins Medical University in the States where they gave meditation practitioners psilocybin and then asked them how it enhanced their meditative practices, and they all overall they said that it did seem to improve, so that there may be some synergy between medication and meditation in that respect. However, of course, you don't need psychedelics whatsoever. Any of us, really. We are psychedelic. Even just breathing is a psychedelic experience. If you don't believe me, try holotropic breath work or inhale some carbogen, and you'll have a psychedelic-like experience. So we don't need psychedelics, but I think they can be very useful in allowing people to understand what is possible.
Well, I agree with David. I think psychedelics can provide a very rapid opening to an awareness of realms of consciousness that one didn't know existed. In my own case, I first took LSD in 1970, and I was at that stage thoroughly indoctrinated with the materialist and atheist worldview, and nothing in my physiology lectures had prepared me for this, and it was a literally mind-opening experience. I later, a year later, got interested in meditation because I wanted to find ways of exploring consciousness without drugs. I meditate daily, and in my experience, meditation, I'm not very visual in my thinking, so my meditation experiences don't have visuals, which psychedelics often do. So it's a different kind of experience. And also, in meditation, there's this, one becomes aware of the workings of the mind, this constant flow of thoughts that goes on. And so I see it as a process of sort of composting thoughts, as well as having those brief moments when there are clearer and more unitive states of consciousness. Whereas psychedelics have a very different effect, at least on me, of much more visual, much more intense, less about composting thoughts than being within a realm of images. There are some psychedelics, 5-methoxy-DMT particularly, which put people in a kind of unitive state without visuals, and those might be perhaps more comparable to advanced states of meditation.
I was thinking more maybe in effect than in experience, so you were saying about a shift in awareness, a recognition of the interconnected nature of existence, and you being a valuable player within that interconnection. So I'm thinking more in effect and as a culture and society moving forwards and facing the challenges we do today. Perhaps I see both as being instrumental, because not everyone can or would want to or could access psychedelics. But maybe as we face the challenges, both can come together. But also for a lot of people, like you were saying, when you were immersed in a materialist outlook on life, a meditation class wouldn't have given you that, and maybe right now we actually need a bit more of a slap in the face that we could get from psychedelics rather than a meditation.
I also think that meditation doesn't necessarily give much contact with the realm of nature. I mean, after all, one's drawing into the kind of root of consciousness itself. And there are other spiritual practices. In my book, for example, I discussed connecting with nature in a variety of ways, or relating to plants, which are much more direct spiritual practices for connecting with the natural world. In a sense, meditation is a kind of withdrawal from the natural world, and although it gives a sense of an underlying consciousness underlying all things, it doesn't really, in my experience, give such an enhanced connection with the diversity of nature. There are other ways of doing that which would work better, I think.
I guess that relates a little bit to the kind of differences between classic kind of plant shamanism and kind of Eastern philosophies and esoteric traditions, in that one is transcendent and it's, you know, it's kind of connecting with a kind of higher self, whereas plant shamanism is more immanent. It's very much of this world and being in the environment. So, you know, one's kind of more horizontal and one's more vertical. But I think they both have things unique to offer, but not necessarily the same thing.
Yes.
And with meditation, we often think of it as quite an individual, a personal journey where you're going inside. Likewise with psychedelics, you're going inside yourself often. And then how do you see the role of ritual and ceremony and community within transpersonal experience and behavioural change? And also interestingly, perhaps to look at morphic resonance with ceremony and ritual as well.
Well, I think I think the fact that there's a whole range of spiritual practices is because they do different things. And so it's not as if one size fits all. And all religions have a range of spiritual practices. I mean, fasting, rituals, singing and chanting, pilgrimage. There's a whole range of practices. So I myself think rituals are important because partly they connect us with those who've done them before. So spiritual experience is about connection, and rituals connect us by being repetitive. They create a link through morphic resonance with those who've done them in the past. So they literally bring the presence of the past into our lives and connect us with the ancestors and those who've done them before us, and also with those who'll do them after us. So I think rituals help connect us with time and with tradition and with continuity. And so they're doing something different from some of these other practices. And all societies have rituals. We all need rituals. They're all there because we all need to have that sense of connection. And people who don't take part in rituals in the modern secular world are cutting off their roots to the whole tradition and the practices of their ancestors. And the net result of being a practicing atheist is to end up with an extremely isolated self in the privacy of one's skull, and without these connections across time that rituals give, and with the wider realms of consciousness that meditation and psychedelics can do. So I think they're vitally important.
And taking these experiences in groups, is the effect increased?
I think so. I think part of the spiritual practices are individual. Like, you can pray on your own, you can meditate on your own, you can be in nature on your own. But also, some of them are about collective activity, and because we're social beings, and many spiritual practices serve to link groups together. And singing and chanting are probably the most powerful. I mean, my wife, Jill Purse, has been doing this for years, teaching groups of singing and chanting. And so through chanting in a group, or chanting simpler than singing, more repetitive, easier to get into in a way, people are literally come into a resonance with each other. First of all, you resonate your own body or through the sound. Secondly, when you're chanting together or singing together, you're breathing at the same time. The whole group is coming into a kind of physiological resonance. And if you're chanting mantras, then by morphic resonance, you're linking with all those who've done them before. So chanting plays an important part. And I think that the reason that all human societies have singing and chanting as part of them, and modern evolutionary theory, following Charles Darwin, takes the view that singing in groups actually came first before language, that language is derived from singing, but singing is more fundamental to human nature than language.
As a kind of personal resonance with Rupert's notions there of morphic resonance and rituals, in my own encounters with the Vilvanica, this psychedelic using shamanic tribe, they've been using peyote, we think, for 5,500 years or probably longer, according to the archaeological evidence, and they have very structured rituals. And one of my first encounters with them in their own place was in the mountains where they live. And upon arriving there was a big gathering of about 2,000 Richolis. They'd all come from their own individual pilgrimages and had come back to the town to have a week-long kind of peyote ceremony, festival. And just being there, I kind of entered into their reality bubble, in a way, in that every time I closed my eyes, I began seeing elements of their cosmology, you know, kind of these fractal peyotes and this cosmic deer, and little kids look like elves, and it was just actually being there. That was before I'd even taken any peyote. And then when I took some peyote, it was no different, in fact. So it's a kind of just literally stepping into their morphic field in a very kind of experiential way.
For someone interested in behavioural change and social change, the concept of morphic resonance is really exciting. Well, it seems really exciting to me and empowering. And I was wondering if this is a misinterpretation, but just in comparison to the idea of fixed laws and the rigidity of who we are and of culture, the idea that we are just enacting a collective memory, but that also by us creating shifts and changes, we can influence the future and each other. Is that something?
Well, morphic resonance cuts both ways. I mean, it's on the one hand, it's a principle of habit, and it means that habits become, through repetition, get into deeper and deeper grooves. So, for example, the mechanistic paradigm in science is a kind of habit of thinking, and people are indoctrinated into it and converted to it in the educational process. And once it's established, it's a very deep-seated habit, hard for people to get out of. On the other hand, morphic resonance means that new ideas, new phenomena can spread quicker than they would otherwise, because the spread of these is facilitated by morphic resonance. So it's good news and bad news from the point of view of social change. It can facilitate changes. And I myself, for example, since we're talking this evening about psychedelics, think that I talked about this at David's conference, Breaking Convention, that when you take a psychedelic, then the nervous activity, your brain cells and neurotransmitters and junctions and stuff, are in the same state as other people who've taken the same psychedelic in the past. So there's a kind of collective memory associated with these altered states of consciousness. And so I think that as social change happens, these facilitated collective memories and morphic resonance processes can actually help to accelerate the process of change. As I say, it's also a conservative principle in that it maintains habits, which we may want to get rid of.
What Rupert said.
We've been talking a lot about a materialist viewpoint where matter is unconscious and evolution is purposelessness, and purposeless. And Rupert, you were speaking about how, in contrast, the spiritual life can be more fulfilling and have a greater sense of purpose. But if we find it hard to connect with that, how else could we imbue our lives with a sense of purpose? And how could we refine our consciousness to be more open to another alternative way?
Well, it's possible to have a sense of purpose without being spiritual. I mean, secular humanists, for example, often have a very strongly developed sense of purpose about improving the lot of humanity. I mean, they have basically Christian ethics without the Christian faith, and often do a better job at sort of bringing about equality, inclusiveness, and so on. And after all, the communists were, they had a very strong sense of purpose. They thought they were going to bring about heaven on earth through the state owning the means of production, distribution, and exchange, and promoting a kind of communistic brotherhood of humanity. So that the Bolshevik revolutionaries had a really strong sense of purpose, but without any spiritual beliefs. They were militantly atheist. The Enlightenment intellectuals, who were anti-Christian and anti-religious, had this very strong sense of human progress through science and reason. And in fact, what drives the modern world, the economic growth model of a transformation of the world through science and technology and economic growth, which is the standard philosophy on which every government works at the moment, is driven with a sense of purpose. The idea there's no purpose outside humanity for secular humanists or for the economic growth proponents. We're the only beings in the whole universe to have purpose, and our purposes are more important than anyone else's or anything else's. And then you get this extremely human-centered view, which is what humanism literally is. It's speciesism that it creates this very human-focused sense of purpose. Now, there are other kinds of atheists who are not secular humanists who live in a state of existential despair and anguish and pessimism. But most common or garden humanists that one meets or atheists actually do have a strong sense of purpose, but it's a secular purpose about the betterment of humanity. And it's actually hard to sustain that if you look in the whole context of the evolution of the cosmos. Here's an entire cosmos evolving totally purposelessly, evolution happening totally purposelessly until sort of apes come out of the trees and turn into people and suddenly have this intense sense of purpose about taking over the world, dominating nature, and creating economic growth. It's a weird philosophy if you think about it.
Very weird one. To quote or misquote somebody far wiser than I think we've got to the point where if you follow the kind of atheism or humanism to its kind of logical conclusions, you do get this kind of nihilistic viewpoint, and materialism in terms of capitalism and in terms of the philosophy of mind are both kind of intellectually, morally, and spiritually bankrupt. I think you said that.
Oh, did I?
Yeah. And I think there is, a fundamental problem with a lack of meaning within. You take the idea of materialism to its logical conclusion, it does become quite nihilistic, and it's seemingly, well, what is the point? Why get out of bed in the morning? But we all do get out of bed, mostly get out of bed in the morning, and I think that's because of our unconscious drives, and if we look to our own unconscious through the imagination and through dreams, that is our kind of true guiding principle, and it kind of harks back to kind of Jungian archetypes and all of these drives that we have to fulfill ourselves, and that there's a meaning in there, whatever our story is that we tell ourselves, that we're going to make the world a better place through transhumanism or have a kind of a spiritual practice. We all have and seek meaning. We create meaning. We are meaning engines. And even if you're a nihilist, you still manage to find a way to get out of bed in the morning, probably because you have an unconscious, I would say.
We're going to open it up to the audience in one or two questions. I wanted to touch on microdosing and find out anything you guys think about it. Because apart from like a grand psychedelic experience, now a lot of people are taking small bits of LSD or psilocybin every day, and this is being held as a way to treat depression, otherwise untreatable. And it's also being seen, as you were speaking about before, to ignite more of an eco-consciousness.
Rupert, do you have anything to say? Are you more of a macrodoser?
I'm in favour of the occasional macro dose.
I'm also more of a macrodose researcher, quote unquote. It's interesting notion. I always get asked these questions when I'm giving talks about microdosing. For those of you who don't know, microdosing is this kind of large kind of phenomena currently where people take sub-threshold doses of psychedelics on a kind of not quite daily level, but it's kind of like psychovitamins every 2 or 3 days, supposedly to enhance creativity, productivity, attention, and also helps with depression and anxiety, according to the anecdotal reports. And lots of people have engaged in this kind of democratic science where they've filled in surveys and they've reported their own experiences, and scientists are diligently collecting this data. And so on the surface of it, it looks like it's really good for all manner of things, a kind of like a panacea. But this is also a bit of a conundrum for scientists. Well, if it's not kind of working at a subjective level, how is it having any kind of beneficial effects? What hasn't been done yet, however, is any kind of controlled scientific studies where looked at this as regards to the placebo effect, apart from the study which we just published last week, which is the first ever randomized placebo-controlled study of microdosing, in this case LSD. But we didn't look at the kind of cognitive benefits of it, we merely looked at time perception. And it does affect time perception, so it may well affect other experiences and functions of cognition. I can't say any more than that, other than it could all be a massive placebo effect, in which case that's no bad news. If taking your microdose of LSD makes you feel less depressed and more productive, then it's no bad thing. But we're yet to see what the hard science has to say about it.
No.
Microdosing. Do you want to say, or should we?
Well, it's just to quickly, on the same subject, there's lots of talk at the moment on legalization of cannabis, of psilocybin in different places, and Luxembourg, I think, might be the first country as of tomorrow, cannabis. And what's the implication, do you think, of these changes in Europe? And what do you think that might mean on a larger scale?
Well, my family and I spend our summers on a remote island in Canada, in British Columbia. It's been legal there at least for medical uses, for quite a long time, and also in California. So, I've actually seen for years places where cannabis is legal, and I think the effects seem to be thoroughly good to me. I prefer the idea of the government getting taxes from this than criminals getting all the profits. So I think sooner or later it's bound to be legalised here, because as Canada has now legalised it for the whole country, unless something goes horribly wrong, when European governments see huge tax revenues flowing into the coffers, they're going to think, well, this looks like a good idea. And it was interesting that, I think it was William Hague, who was an eminent Conservative politician, a few months ago when there was a controversy about medical cannabis here in Britain for children with epileptic seizures, wrote an article in the Daily Telegraph saying the war against drugs has been lost, the sooner we legalise it the better. And if an eminent Conservative elder statesman writes that in the Daily Telegraph, then it shows the mood is shifting.
He's probably got shares in Monsanto.
In relation to, I personally think that the main benefit, at least from the research point of view, the fact it's legal in certain parts of the world, means that now a whole lot more research will become possible on cannabis that wasn't possible before. And I think it's going to present all sorts of very interesting new challenges. For example, in Colorado, where it's been legal for some time in the United States, religious groups are having to come to grips with it. They can't follow the just say no policy anymore. There are groups of Jewish people, for example, who have now incorporated cannabis, particularly cannabis-infused bagels, into the Havdalah ceremony, which is at the end of the Sabbath, which is when people gather together, drink wine, smell sweet spices, incorporated cannabis into a traditional Jewish ritual. in places where it's legal. I even found a remarkable online thing about Bible study groups in Colorado, where a lot of people were saying that their appreciation of Jesus was enormously enhanced by the entire Bible study group is having cannabis before their sessions. So all sorts of unexpected new developments are already taking place in places where it's legal.
On the Canadian front, there was a really wonderful quip how Canada is the first person to really, truly take the Bible to heart and interpret it literally. There's a quote from Leviticus where if a man lies with another man, he should be stoned. And they decriminalised, they put gay marriage legal and decriminalised cannabis. So it's all good news on that front. And I think cannabis is the start of it, in terms of, first of all, it's been decriminalised for medical use and then also for recreational use, and that's only going to continue to increase, I believe. And we're starting to see similar things starting for psychedelic substances like psilocybin, which is they're tabling whether or not to decriminalise it in Oregon, in the States, and also it's been fast-tracked as in terms of the process for getting it licensed as a medicament in the treatment of depression. So it means that it could well be licensed for use within the next 3 to 5 years instead of the next 20 years, which is really rather good news. So I think the times are changing, and this is really only a very small legal blip in history, you know. It's a kind of a cultural prejudice that psychedelics are currently prohibited. It wasn't always the case, and it probably won't always be the case, and I think we'll look back on this as some kind of dark ages in a way, and things will change.
Thank you. Does anyone like to ask a question in the audience? Yeah.
My question was that the tribes that you've been studying, the taking of psychedelics was under the guidance of priests, shamanic priests, and therefore it was a form of initiation. It was not done. So, shall I repeat?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So my question is about the ceremonies you've experienced in South America, I suppose, that were presumably led by shamanic priests. And therefore the drugs were not taken as a form of entertainment, as a form of initiation, under the guidance of people who had some other form of education or preparation. And I'm wondering what your thought is about precisely the fact that these things, even in these tribes, I assume, are only taken under a particular set of circumstances and not as a form simply of entertainment that people will do just without guidance.
Did everybody get that? It was about the use in a kind of shamanic context of psychedelic substances. They're usually done in a very well contained, prescribed way, usually under the guidance of a shaman. Yeah, and this is often the case, and you know, we should probably be looking to these cultures and communities for practice and good guidance on how to use these substances, because you know, in many cases they've been using them for many thousands of years, and you really get a sense of that when you go and spend time with them. They are quite different, I would say, as a community in many respects. And so I think there's something we can learn from the way in which they do use these substances. And of course, in the West, since the discovery of LSD in the 1940s, and then what happened in the 50s and 60s, they're often taken in a recreational context. And I think that may also have its place. I'm not going to say, oh, people shouldn't take them recreationally, but I think that if people do take them recreationally, they often may come unstuck, because these things are not just recreational. You know, they can lead to profound experiences and encounters with your own unconscious, and you could end up having a year's worth of spontaneous psychotherapy in one night, which, you know, in the right context isn't always appropriate. In the wrong context isn't appropriate. You know, taking So, I mean, you wouldn't dream of taking ayahuasca in a nightclub, I don't think. And I think in the West, we've probably come to realise that there's a lot to be said about setting and the context in which you take it, and having a container, and having people who are more experienced to guide you through the process, etc. And I don't think psychedelics are for everyone, and I don't think there's necessarily there isn't always the right setting. You know, there is sometimes the wrong setting, and I think there's a lot to be learned from shamanic cultures and traditions about how you can maximize your benefits from taking psychedelics and reduce the harms that you may do in taking them. So yeah, I think it's useful we can learn something from them. To answer your question.
Question for Rupert. You're talking about the mind. Have you got any idea what the mind is made of? Can it be measured or understood in any other way? Because obviously it doesn't seem bound by normal laws, but is there any way of defining what it is?
Well, first of all, when we use the word mind in English, we distinguish between conscious and unconscious mind. So a large part of our mind is unconscious, as Freud and Jung and many others have pointed out. So the mind is not the same as consciousness. It's a system of fields, forms, patterns, structures. Minds are structured, and I think they're structured by what I call morphic fields, which are organizing patterns. They're patterns, forms, and habits. Now, consciousness is distinguishable from the mind, because consciousness is obviously conscious as opposed to unconscious. You can have unconscious minds, but you can't really have unconscious consciousness. And I think of consciousness in a way that's very influenced by the philosopher Whitehead, who points out that consciousness is primarily concerned with possibility. Our conscious minds are about all sorts of possibilities, and their main function is to choose among possibilities. So the conscious mind is full of possibilities which are not physical facts yet. They only become physical facts when we've made a choice, then a measurable change occurs. So Whitehead also pointed out that this is true. He was a panpsychist. He thought there's a level of consciousness all through nature. That even in the Schrödinger wave equation in quantum mechanics, what that equation does is tell you all the possible things an electron or a quantum particle could do. It doesn't tell you what it will do, it tells you all the possibilities. And they're not physical facts, they're virtual possibilities. As soon as that electron interacts with something and something happens, all those possibilities collapse down to a measurable event. But that's now in the past. And Whitehead pointed out that the best way of understanding the relation of mind and body, or consciousness and body, is that the consciousness is concerned with the future possibilities and choices among them. And whereas as soon as a decision is made, it's in the past, it becomes a measurable physical fact. But immediately a whole new range of possibilities open up. So his point was the relation of mind and body is the relation in time between past, future and past, not in space, like inner and outer. We usually think of these in terms of spatial metaphors. So exactly how one models possibilities, I mean, well, we experience them. We experience them all the time, every time we think, and every time we dream. They're all about possibilities, some very unlikely possibilities, especially in dreams. But we inhabit a virtual world of possibility. But this world also has shapes and forms. Our dreams have forms, patterns, shapes, colours sometimes. And those are structures within the mind. And if we come back to the models of consciousness, of ultimate consciousness that I mentioned earlier, then those all have a ground of being, a ground of consciousness itself. And then within that, the contents of consciousness, which all have form, structure and pattern, names and forms, nama rupa, as the Indians put it. So that's one way. I would say that they have measurable effects. Every mental decision you make, every one of us made the decision to come here this evening. At one time it was one among many possibilities for this evening, and it's certainly a measurable effect of that decision that we're here. We can be photographed in this room, weighed, etc., and it's a physical fact that we're here. So consciousness certainly has measurable effects, and minds have measurable effects. Whether you could measure the mind in itself, other than its effects, is unlikely. The gravitational field has measurable effects. That's how we know it exists. But if you just took a little bit of space with nothing in it, it's just invisible. So we know them through their effects.
Thank you.
So this is a question for both of you. First of all, Rupert, I was wondering if your model of morphic resonance could be used to explain synchronicities and archetypes, and conversely, David, I was wondering if archetypes and synchronicities could be a way of looking at morphic resonance.
All right. Well, the term synchronicity, as used by Jung, is very ambiguous. He used it to cover meaningful coincidences, but also things that I think are more properly classified as telepathic or psychokinetic. So what he called synchronicity, I think, has to be further divided into things that are regular psychic phenomena and meaningful coincidences. Now, whether or not meaningful coincidences are shaped by morphic fields, I don't know, because morphic fields are mainly about repetitive patterns in nature. The morphic fields of cabbages produce cabbages, and of oak trees produce oak trees. Their normal role is to produce repetitive patterns. Whereas the whole thing about meaningful coincidences, they're surprising. They may suggest some higher level of organizational principle, and they probably do. But it's not morphic resonance as normally understood. Archetypes are repetitive patterns in collective memory, in Jung's theory of archetypes, and those would fit very well with morphic fields. I mean, if Jung's collective unconscious didn't exist, it would have to be invented in the context of morphic resonance, because it's about collective memories, collective patterns, which are in the collective unconscious. And the same is true of all species. They all have collective memories from this point of view. But meaningful coincidences are much harder to explain, and whether they're meaningful or not depends very much on our mind and our receptivity. So partly it's our own mind that gives them meaning, or finds the meaning in them. But whether they're a communication from other forms of mind, whether they're ways in which we find a connection or a meaning in what would otherwise be called coincidences, is a question for which there's no simple, straightforward, one-size-fits-all answer.
I'm glad you said that last bit, Rupert. In short, to answer your question of whether or not synchronicities and archetypes could be used to explore or explain morphic resonance, yes. And I would say, but I wouldn't know how to approach that in a kind of testable, experimental way as a scientist, other than to say, through my own experiential researches, I've found that archetypal experiences could well be explained through morphic resonance, and I think there's also a relationship there with synchronicities. I could give you a very long example, but I'll try and boil it down to a very short example, and that is through my research with DMT. There seemed to be a preponderance. I had my own encounter experience with this kind of archetypal-like form. I call it archetypal because when I started looking into it, there was a number of other people who'd also had the very, very similar encounter experiences under the influence of DMT, and it also seemed to resonate with mythological beings in various different traditions that all seem to serve the same function. So there was a kind of a sense in which this archetype seemed to kind of resonate through time and through myth and culture, and also through people's DMT experiences. I really need to kind of, you'd have to read the paper to kind of glean some more from it from that. But interwoven with all of that are a lot of synchronicities, my own synchronicities of discovering these resonances as well. But whether or not that amounts to the same thing is a whole different discussion. I'd like to see Rupert join up the dots between synchronicity and morphic resonance, but he's a greater mind than I am, so I'll leave him to that. It's his theory after all.
Thank you so much.
Do you want to pass it to Stephen there?
Hi both. So my question is, apart from the healthy integration of psychedelic substances, psychedelic experiences into mainstream society, what are the other most important things we might do in an attempt to avert impending ecological collapse?
Well, quite. So, I mean, obviously, I think take action. Sorry?
Save the bees.
Save the bees. Well, many things. I mean, I think psychedelics. I'm going to go back to the psychedelics. I think they have a role in enhancing our connectivity, and I think that's important. If we are going to do something, I mean, if you have the first of all belief that we have an ecological crisis on our hands to do something about it, and I think, and also then to engage with it, you need to have an engagement with it on a conscious level. It's about changing consciousness, I think. And I think this is where all kinds of practices, from meditation to pilgrimage to a spiritual practice to psychedelics, can have a role in tuning people into nature, changing their consciousness, and recognizing that we do have a problem, and then taking some action based upon that. And that action can take myriad forms. It could be an increase in gardening or getting involved in ecological activism. But I think the reason for me, my approach to the ecological situation is understanding how we can affect change of people's consciousness in the first place, because that's fundamental. Without the change in consciousness and without the shift in awareness, we're not going to see any kind of translation into behavioural changes either. So that's for me where activism starts.
Well, for me, it obviously has to have a huge political and economic dimension as well. And a new president of Brazil, behaving a bit like Trump, can lead to huge areas of deforestation within a few years through completely misguided approaches, allied with banking forces, industrial forces, investors, and so forth. I mean, the amount of damage that can be done by this vast economic and political and banking system that we've created is just unthinkable. And so individual change, me eating a beetroot burger, for example, instead of a meat one, is important as part of that. But there's no substitute for the political activity that's needed as well.
Well, I just wanted to add that, can someone help me with this fact? Is it something like it's only 100 companies in the world that contribute to something like 80% of... Does anyone know this? I can't remember the exact... 75%? Thank you. So obviously what Ruby and I do is that we look at marrying your inner activism, so how you can transform your relationship with yourself, with others, and with the natural world, and that being instrumental to any kind of advancement in the face of ecological collapse. But then at the same time, it has to be something top down as well, because it can only be, well, it seems it can only be politicians and governments who can change the laws that enable corporations to do the damage that they're doing. But the government's never going to do that until the people rise up and tell them that we need that. In the same way as African American rights and gay rights and women's rights, that was never handed to anyone. It was always from the bottom up, but it always had to be in the end from the top down. So I see both of you as like spot on, because it is about a shift in consciousness, and I like the idea of morphic resonance. If you can ignite that with yourself, then you can maybe, I still don't know if I actually got that right.
creating change at a mass level. So it's like talking a lot about what you're doing and inspiring others around you. It's not keeping it all to yourself, because otherwise that mass change will never come, and it will never be top down.
But it's definitely got to be both, doesn't it?
You can feel the massive change about to happen. And what we comes to my question, do you think consciousness is as solid as the silent, for example? Do you think joint consciousness and for example, I went to a thing like this weekend where the power of 8 it was called, and therefore groups of 8 people thinking the same thing at the same time and actually working to heal people. And in fact, what the lady was talking about was working on healing the world, and she was doing it's Lynn McTaggart, and therefore consciousness, people consciously thinking about healing, for example, Palestine and Israel and conflict between them. And I did a thing 25, 30 years ago where we were healing Europe and we're using consciousness as the main thing. Takes it a step first if you like, but I do think consciousness is the biggest thing. So the question, do you think that as well? Do you think it could work, in fact?
I couldn't get the question.
I think the power of intention is hugely important, obviously, but I mean not just on a psychic level with the kind of parapsychological realm. I think that's obviously my area of research and my own particular avenue. I think obviously kind of the power of intention to actually physically act in the material world is probably going to have much more immediate effects. But I think I like to think that intention collectively can also have an effect. We don't really understand the nature of reality fully. It's certainly at least material and conscious, if not primarily consciousness. So I think consciousness is vastly underestimated. Actually, I know you were talking about with Lynn, and I was talking to her about the notion of intention actually changing the world around us, and it occurred to me that the people at Stonehenge, it was said historically that. Sorry, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I was talking to an artist who is the artist in residence at CERN, Particle Accelerator, and he's been working there, and he's asked to interpret what's going on at CERN. He was saying, well, think of it in terms of future archaeologists. They're going to look at this place and they're going to wonder what it was, and they'll say it's some kind of ritual structure where they're performing rituals. And then it occurred to me there's a really interesting notion. There's this project called the Global Consciousness Project, whereby they've got these random number generators dotted all over the globe, and they look at events which happen on a global scale, where everybody comes into a kind of global consciousness, where people are focusing on the same kind of current issue. And it could be a disaster like an earthquake, or a massive meditation, or Olympic Games, or a football match, or something like that. And they find deviations in the outputs of these random number generators, in that they don't look as random anymore. They take on a kind of a sense of order temporarily. And according to the researchers, this reflects this kind of group mind effect. And so then it occurred to me that the results they've got, the size of the results on a kind of statistical level, if you know anything about statistics, are kind of huge. They've kind of got 7 sigma results. That means the chance of getting these results by chance is 1 in billions, and whereas the Higgs boson, going back to CERN Particle Accelerator, the evidence, the fact that this particle exists, it's purely statistical as well. It's based on this kind of probabilistic notion that if it exists, it's kind of greater than a 5 sigma value. It's greater than 1 in a few billion. And so it occurred to me that this whole thing at CERN really is like a ritual structure. It's basically a lot of physicists getting together, going, oh, we think this particle exists, and then somehow doing a massive psychokinesis intention experiment and finding the results they're looking for. We don't know, but it could well be, and maybe future archaeologists will be right, that the power of intention to create our reality and our physical reality is very genuine. There's a bit of a tangent, but yeah, to answer your question?
We have time for one snappy question.
I don't really have a question, but I wanted to
Do you
ask.
know what the noosphere is and noology? And it just keeps screaming into my mind.
That's not the way it works. But
Do you want to answer that? I was waiting for the hand up.
no. You answer no work.
Do I know what the noosphere is and noology? Well, I kind of know what the noosphere is, and that's kind of Vanadsky's kind of notion of this, a kind of like a field, I suppose, of like the logos. The kind of knowledge or information has its own kind of residence, if you like. And I think collective consciousness could equate to the noosphere in some respects, or even the internet in some respects is kind of like the digital version of the noosphere. And the internet in its own right is really just it's many things, because it's both a communication tool and it's this kind of massive dreaming, but it's also like our kind of collective clairvoyance, if you like, as well. In that, if you want to know something, you can access it, you just Google it, right? In the past we didn't have the internet, we had to dream it into existence because perhaps our clairvoyance wasn't really up to scratch enough. But before that, you'd consult your Akashic record, or you would go into your imagination, you'd go into the dreaming if you want to understand things. The psychedelic tribe I work with say, you take peyote and he'll tell you whatever you need to know. That's their internet, right? And that's their access to the noosphere. What we've actually done is kind of taken that notion and made it material in the construct of the internet itself. And I think, modern telecommunications were all born out of this notion of accessing latent psychic abilities like telepathy and clairvoyance. And in fact, all the earliest inventors of modern telecommunications were all spiritualists, and they're trying to find ways of transcommunication with spirits of the dead. Logie Baird, television, Marconi, Alexander Graham Bell, they're all spiritualists trying to find means of communication, transcommunication with the spirit realm, and they came up with modern telecommunications. So basically, it's kind of, I see modern telecommunications as a kind of rebranding exercise of our kind of dormant psychic abilities, and when we actually wake up and realise that we don't need the digital version, we can do away with that and all become super psychic. And it's kind of already happening if you look at Rupert's telephone telepathy experiments, in that people automatically know who's calling them when they call up from the other side of the planet and they haven't heard from them in years. Anyway, that's a fanciful idea, but I won't put too much store in it.
Yeah, I think the noosphere, it comes from the Greek word nous, for intellect, or not knowledge or insight, as in noetic, like in the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And I think there's lots of different levels. I mean, the noosphere of just the Earth is, as David said, perhaps a rebranded version of It's Just Humanity. After all, it excludes practically everything else apart from humanity. All the species we're driving to extinction don't have websites on or Instagram accounts in modern telecommunications. It may be that the whole solar system has a noosphere. Maybe the galaxy has one. It may be the entire universe has one. I think there may be different levels of these organizing fields of knowledge. I think since we're about to end, David got in a short plug, and I'd like to get in a plug too. On March the 2nd, for the first time, I'm giving a workshop in London together with my two sons, Merlin and Cosmo. Cosmo is a musician, Merlin's an ecologist. And my wife Jill, their mother, who's here this evening, is also going to be leading off with some chanting. It is called Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. And the details are on my website, so that's the plan. March the 2nd.